attention to what's on the lectionary. Found myself in Luke's Gospel, the only Gospel in the New Testament written by a non-Jew or a Gentile. Came across a couple parables that Jesus shares with his disciples, and couldn't help but see in these parables how little culture has changed. See what you think. I'm in the 18th chapter of Luke's Gospel, and I'm sharing with you what is the first 14 verses of the 18th chapter. Two parables here that Jesus teaches his disciples and anyone who will hear. Let us listen to the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Holy Scripture. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to the judge and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while the judge refused. But later he said to himself, 'Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by her continual coming.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, God will quickly grant justice to them, and yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others as with contempt. Jesus said 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, and was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exhausted. May God add God's blessing to the reading of the Word. My wife and I was going this week over to Walmart to buy some supplies for our party Friday night. It was early in the morning, and there was all these people with shopping carts leaving Walmart and going out into the woods. And other people coming from the woods with shopping carts and going into Walmart. Obviously unbathed, not well kept. Sherry says, there's a tent city out there in those woods, just on the south side of Walmart, don't you? He said, yeah, I heard about that. You hear about LA, San Francisco, New York, Texas, places all over being infiltrated with people that are homeless, people that can't afford the cost of living. We worry about our children going out into society and culture alone. We even worry about what they surf on the World Wide Web. And while we boast in our accomplishments and in what you might call our so-called advancements, do we really think, with all that's going on around us in the 21st century, that we are smarter, wiser than our ancestors? You see, what I find in these two parables is a culture that is much like ours of today. And yet today's culture thinks that all of our ancestry was idiotic, prejudiced, stupid, dumb, and had no common sense. And when I read these writings that are almost 2,000 years old, I sometimes contemplate whether these folks who walked this planet before us were maybe even smarter and wiser and had more common sense than we do today. When I was a little kid, They taught me that before I crossed the street, I was supposed to look both ways. But do you watch today's kids cross the street? And yet we're smarter. Because we have more information at our fingertips. We can just Google it. Like, that's a reliable source? So we don't need prayer. We don't need to worry about what God is doing, because we live in grace. So, what's God going to do to us if we break a few commandments? Or, if we boast about our own accomplishments in this life as a way of trying to justify and exalt ourselves. Sometimes I look around at America today and I say, and we can't figure out why we're in the mess we're in. You don't have prayer in schools anymore. It's against the rules. It's a big debate in your state houses, in Congress. I mean, anytime you bring up God and religion, it's, oh, I'm offended. And yet, we like to think we're more civilized. These two parables that Jesus shares with us through Luke's Gospel both talk about the need for prayer, but they aren't just about the blessing and the gift of prayer. There's a deeper meaning within these two parables that revolves around prayer. And prayer is one of the great tools that is so underused in today's world, that we don't receive the blessing that God so freely wants to give us, because we don't ask God for those blessings. We decide we'll bring them into our world ourselves. This first parable about the unjust judge, Jesus says he had no respect for God and he has no respect for the people. I can point to you about any politician running for office in November and put them in the same category. They'll break any rules. They'll lie to us flat out or face to face. And they will lie to God. And it's not just politicians. It's business people. It's community servants. It's doctors, lawyers, judges. And sadly, a lot of Christians fall into the same category of this unjust judge. No respect for God, no respect for God's children. What do we hold sacred anymore as a culture? Very little. And once something does lose its sacredness, can it be restored? The unjust judge has no desire whatsoever to bring this widow any kind of justice. A judge is one of the more powerful people in societies. By a single decision, can determine the outcome of someone else's life for the rest of their life. And a widow, not unlike today, is at the lowest area of power in today's world, because we don't give widows any respect. They're just old folks. They don't know what they're talking about. Life's a lot different than it was back in 1940 and 50. That stuff doesn't apply anymore. We don't need your wisdom. We got Google. judge doesn't want to be publicly embarrassed. Oh, does this sound like us? And so out of this motivation to not be embarrassed publicly, the judge decides he wants to get rid of this nuisance who keeps coming into his courtroom and begging him for justice. And so he finally grants it. And Jesus takes these two figures, the unjust judge and the widow, and their story and relationship with each other, and turns it on us, saying that if an unjust judge will do this for a widow that he has no respect for and who is powerless, how much more will a good God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry night and day to him? But who of us cry night and day to God? Who of us spend 10 minutes of our day in conversation with him? Jesus asked a very telling question in this parable. If Jesus comes tomorrow, will he find faith in God on this planet? Or is our faith here in our money and in our internet and on TikTok and Twitter and Facebook? I think Jesus asked a legitimate question here. Will he find faith? Maybe if we did more praying, we would receive more of God's blessings. Maybe if we spent more time in God's presence, we would know God's will for our life better. And then maybe as individuals and as a culture, we can make decisions that are in line with God's will for us, instead of making choices and decisions that are economically sound or are socially acceptable and what you might call woke. Our need at the food pantry since May has doubled. We went from serving 30 families a week back in May to in June, we went to 60 families a week. The food pantry is not getting any more money than it usually gets in, and so the resources are dwindling. And back in July, I went to our treasurer of the food pantry and I said, we're going to have to spend more money. Our need has increased. And the treasurer came to me 2 weeks ago and said, well, if you keep going at this rate, you're going to be out of money in December. Monday, the pantry at 53rd Street Lutheran Church calls me and says, hey, I got all this extra produce. You want it? I said, sure. Tuesday, the food pantry in Middletown calls me and says, hey, we got our Future Farmers of America delivery and I got all this extra food. You want it? I said, sure. And I came home from those two conversations and getting all that food, and I thought, God is providing. God is hearing my prayer. God is listening. But are we praying? We have a few prayer warriors in our church. And I will tell you, without naming them by name, that they will all agree on one common thing when it comes to being a prayer warrior. Reminds me of a story or an experience I had in Indianapolis as part of a ministerial association. When an old black minister got up and says, you haven't prayed enough until you begin to bleed. And I understand understood from where he was coming from his perspective of decades and decades of poverty, prejudice, and social underclass. Sometimes it takes a long time and a lot of prayer to get justice. Prayer warriors know that. It's not just a simple, hey, God, give me and thanks, move on with our lives. Sometimes we got to show some faith in that. And of course, when Jesus says in the parable, God will come quickly, well, that's an interesting term, is it not? For my mother, God has never come quick enough. But yet Mom also understands that God has eternity to answer prayers. We're the ones that feel like we are limited by time. But as Christians, we all should be prayer warriors. We should be just like this unpowerful widow who keeps coming and coming and coming and asking and asking and asking. God should be sick of listening to our voices and our requests and our thanksgiving. And Jesus promises us that God will answer. The second parable is not so much about the frequency of prayer, but the kind of prayers we preach. And unfortunately, I hear way too much of this Pharisee prayer. God, thank God I'm not like them people living on the streets. Thank God I'm not one of them people having to go to the food pantry. Thank God I'm not one of them people living in poverty. Thank God I wasn't born African American. That's not the kind of prayer we need to be praying, is it? Could you imagine Jesus on the cross? Boy, I'm glad I'm not them folks out there. There's a sense of superiority that comes when we join the faith. That we have the corner on God's blessings and on God's knowledge and wisdom, and everybody else doesn't. And that's what this Pharisee demonstrates in this prayer. I'm a good guy, God. I tithe. I fast. Thank God I'm not like that tax collector, the traitor, who turned on his own people to collect taxes for another country, who is the lowest of low. No, I'm a Pharisee, and I give thanks that I can tithe, and I can fast, and I give thanks that I'm not like thieves and rogues and adulterers and other lowlives. How many Pharisees do we know like that in today's world? Whose prayer is not for God's blessings, but whose prayer shows contempt for God's creatures. And then on the opposite side, you have the traitor, the tax collector, who can't even look up to the heavens, who is beating on his breast and confessing that he falls short of God's glory. Jesus says that's the one that gets exalted. Maybe one of the pet peeves that I deal with in the 21st century is we have so many Americans that walk through life and don't see anything wrong with themselves. They love who they are, and they don't acknowledge the fact that they fall short. They're not going to change for God, and they're certainly not going to change for one of us. They're going to stay true to what they think is their saintliness, and in their ignorance of not being able to acknowledge their shortcomings, their faults, their sins, how can they find forgiveness when they can't even ask for it? All who want to exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. I just shared with you last week about two disciples who wanted to sit at the right and left hand of God. And Jesus had a problem with that. And I live in a world in which everybody wants to be exalted as great talents and great skills and great abilities and great looks and great personality. And aren't we just great? And I very rarely see anyone hold themselves accountable for what they do, what they don't do, and who they are and who they are not. Do you ever hear anyone on your television say, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake"? Do you ever hear anyone in the community that says, "Yeah, that was my fault. I'll take responsibility for that"? You even see that in the life of the church. Jesus is telling us that we need to be more like the tax collector than the Pharisee. Only Jesus could stand before God and give thanks that he's not like the adulterer or the thief or the rogue or even the tax collector. Because you see, Jesus was truly sinless. He didn't have the sin of pride and arrogance that you and I deal with. He knew his place in the universe. And that place was to follow God's will for his life. The one person who's walked this planet that should have been exalted, praised, hosannas, gets crucified on a cross because he humbled himself and allowed the powers of the world to be his destiny. They lost because God won. And God won not because Jesus exalted his excellentness, because he humbled himself. You know, I think it took me at least 40 years, if not 50, to learn the blessing of humility. Because every time I got cocky and I thought I knew it all and went into my Frank Sinatra doing it my way kind of thing, God would knock me back down again. And I got tired of getting knocked down. And I finally learned that, yes, I am human. Yes, I do make mistakes. Yes, I too am a sinner each and every day of my life. Can you admit that to God and to yourself? There's a blessing within it if you can. If you cannot, then the arrogance and pride goes to the same place that it has always gone. The Romans thought they were the most powerful empire in the history of the world. They lasted 500 years, and they are gone. They're gone. America has been here, what, 240 something? Is our pride and our arrogance going to lead us down the same path as the Romans? You know what they say, when in Rome, do what the Romans do, right? And look where we are, folks. Look at the mess we have because we cannot acknowledge that we are wrong, that we make mistakes, that we have sinned against God and showed Him no respect for what He taught us and what He showed us. And we really don't have a lot of respect for God's creation, as we do with it as we will. I hope these two parables are not just examples of how the world was back in Jesus' time in the flesh, but I hope these two parables can be examples of where we are today. And may we pray for God's revival again, that God can make us whole and restore us once again, that He can offer His grace once again, that He can pour out His love and Spirit of life, and that we will be receptive to those gifts and share them just as His Son did with all of creation. I think we are in need of revival, not in a national sense, but in a personal one. We need to be honest with who we are, what we think about God's creatures, and how we treat the one who gives us life.